Good evening, everybody.
Evening.
Just FYI, there's there's going to be handouts for the material covered this evening, and they're also going to be referring to it here on the screen. So it's a little small type. If you all want to move closer, you're going to be able to see better. Bob and I are going to cover this month in beekeeping. I don't know if we want to start out with what you think people should be thinking about doing and looking at, and then we'll answer questions.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm just going to start off with some of the most obvious things that I would be looking for in the next 30 days, between now and our next meeting is critical to make sure your bees have enough stores. You got about 4 to 5 weeks to get the amount of weight on the hive to get through the winter. So make sure that you're checking that now. And after you do this a while, you can learn how to lift the hive. We call it hefting to the back. Lift it up. And it should be real heavy. Well, what's the definition of real heavy? Well, I mean, it should be where you kind of struggle a little bit to get it up off the stand. And if it's light where you just kind of lift it right up, then you really have to take some action. It's still, the easiest way, I guess, is one of the ways is use liquid. You don't have to start that right now. You can start that the 1st of October, unless they really need something now. But now, if you're going to feed liquid, you got to be really careful that you don't start robbing. You need to put an entrance reducer in, make sure you don't spill anything, and maybe feed them some sugar water so they don't starve. And then maybe give them a heavier dose 1st of October. And what you do this time of the year is you feed 2 parts sugar and 1 part water. And a real simple formula, small scale, is like a gallon of water. That's 8 pounds. So you use 2 gallons of water, that's 16, and 8 pounds of sugar, 2 bags. And I like to heat it up, or get it as hot as I can, not boiling, but warm. And I use a paint stirrer on a drill and to stir it up in a 5-gallon bucket to get it liquid. And then you can feed it through a top feeder or a division board feeder. And Jay's got all kinds of other kind of feeders, bucket feeders. But I've always used the top feeder. You can get top feeders. I use 3 gallons, but I only put in maybe half full because they don't take it. I don't. If they take it slowly, I don't want it to spoil. So really important to make sure your bees are right now are being fed or taken care of. You can feed candy trays too a little later. You got to get them up to the farm for the food. I'd say in the next 30 days, by the middle of October, then it starts getting colder and the bees won't take liquid that easy.
The feeding, the feeding is going to actually help them get in position for winter, which, for winter, you want the brood and the bees in the lower box and the feed above them. And if you start feeding them now or soon, and they start filling the cells in the top box, it will kind of naturally restrict the queen down to the lower box, and so that she'll, and we think that she'll lay, if we get a bump on a little bit of a nectar flow on goldenrod, we kind of want that because that'd be the start of your winter bees. So, they build up in the spring, they plateau, their production drops down. We have heat or dearth, the queen's actually shut down for a while. But now if we get this little fall flow, she'll start laying again. And you want that because those are going to be your winter bees, but you kind of want them in the lower quadrant. So I would say you can either do that in 2 ways, by feeding them and encouraging them to fill the top box and keep the brood to the lower box. I kind of say about 70% of colonies do that on their own, and about 30% of colonies, don't read the book, don't get the memo, and October 15th is when I can go to all my hives. I heft them, see if they need help with stores, and I make sure that they're in winter position. And if they're not, I put them in winter position in mid-October, so about a month from now. So you have a month for them to, get with the program and build up some weight on goldenrod or supplement if they're really light. And I have hives that are right next to each other. One is so heavy I can't lift it, and one is so light that it needs to be fed. So you really do have to do this case by case. Every colony can be different. So hefting a hive is the easiest thing you can do. You're not stressing the bees in any way. You're not exposing them to potential robbers, and that will tell you the information that you need now, for the next 6 weeks to decide, what your feeding regimen needs to be. The other things I think they're still dealing with that we talked about last month are hive beetles and varroa mites. I know people are still treating for varroa mites. I actually have a couple of customers who are diligently, monitoring post-treatment and actually having, still having high mite counts, and they're, wondering if they need to do a second round of treatment. So that's a thing, that's potentially, the bees are not getting treated completely, or they're picking up mites in the environment. So there's absolutely good reasons for retesting even after you do your mite treatment to make sure your mite treatment worked, or or if they need to be treated again. So some people are still dealing with mite treatments now. Hive beetles are, as I said, still bad. The one thing I've kind of been suggesting to people for hive beetles is not to scrape the propolis, because I've been with beekeepers who are very tidy about cleaning up extra propolis, and we've learned, that that's a thing. Propolis serves a purpose, and I would say when it comes to hive beetles, if you can leave that on the inner cover and a little bit on the box, so that when you put your boxes back together, I actually, I push the inner cover down, put the telescoping cover on, push it down, because I want to seal that up so they can't, get back in from the top. Any questions? Anybody having any issues, Kathy?
I did a hackathon a month in August, and today I noticed that I had 2 to 3 bees that had virus, and I'm just curious now what I was starting to just do the feeding,
Right.
and now I'm kind of.
Well, I mean, I'll share with you, I think Dr. Peck, when he was here, I don't know, several months ago, he said that the bees can be affected by disease before you even see elevated mite counts, because the mites are vectoring disease. So if we all do a sample August 1st and we have an elevated mite level, you're treating the mites, but potentially they are already being affected or stressed by the disease. And I think that that's potentially what you're observing. So my recommendation, I know we talked about this the other day, your question was, should I treat again? And potentially you would treat again, but I think for right now, maybe feeding with a health supplement to maybe help them fend off the effects of these diseases. Those bees are not going to get healthier; they're going to die off. But the bees that are, developing, I think you want to kind of support their good health, and then maybe treat again in a week or 2. But I think, yeah. So the treating. Additionally, there is an argument for that, but that also is stressful. So you got to I think you're going to do both, but I think you need to feed and maybe supplement for a week or 2, and then and then monitor again and see if you need to treat again.
So it's not the end of the world if I'm seeing.
No, it's not the end of the world. Deformed wing virus is the most common mite vector disease. It's also the one that is evident when they are born or hatch or emerge, right? So other diseases, you can't tell if they have it or not. It's not obvious. Deformed wing virus is. So you're seeing it and we recognize it. And yes, the science is saying that it is the most contagious and distributed disease. But you know, I think they always have a level of these diseases. These diseases were identified and in bees before mites. The mites exacerbate the effects of the disease. So yes, you want to do both. You want to try to support their health and reduce the mite levels. Both. Anybody else? Yes.
Hi, so I'm new to beekeeping and I'll be starting my first time, come this next spring. My challenge is I live in the city, so my space is a little bit confined. Are there any tips or things that I should look out for with starting?
Sure.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of tips.
Well, I will say we've quite a few members that are urban beekeepers. And there's a couple of micro clubs, I'm going to call them, groups that meet that are, you know, very specific to like Tower Grove Heights area and Maplewood. So, I mean, you might look to talk to those folks about their unique challenges. But, you know, bees fly for 2 months. So there are things that you can do to restrict their movement to your neighbor's yards by encouraging them to fly quickly. It's like an airplane taking off on a short runway. So that's the biggest advice that we have for, you know, people that are in small spaces. And I would encourage you to maybe join one of these little groups in the city. And if you need some names, is Michael Kilfoy here?
No.
He's usually here. We'll hook you up with somebody. Sure.
Also,
Yeah.
Come talk to me
Take a listen.
afterward, sir. I live in the city and I can talk to you about my experiences.
I appreciate it.
A workshop would be great too.
Yeah. So John's gonna mention the EMBA workshop in February. So you should plan on attending.
Jane, I got a question. Up at the NBA, they use Formic Pro. Do they usually take that all out of the hive like they would?
Formic Pro,
The patties?
it's a pad, and
Right.
it
They
doesn't,
don't tear it apart, take it out. So when you open it back up, I feel it.
It's gonna be
So
hard as
they're
a rock.
still- They are hard as a rock.
Yeah.
Okay,
it evaporates. It's a few.
okay. I was just wondering.
So I have to think about HR, but the EMBA is doing a conference, February 10th on Saturday. It's a one-day conference. So just flash out for information for that.
Okay, thanks.
So Avigard, which is what we use in our hives, I found several of our hives, stronger ones, have just put so much propolis all around and underneath the card, and we use the tub, you know, of the Avigard, like it's like bubble gum up there, and if we weren't treating it, it'd be amazing to save all that. But there was at least one hive that actually propolized the Avigard. So do you think that
Was
they
it
even
at
got,
the top?
yeah,
Were you doing it at the top?
encapsulated it basically? Do you think they even got any of the effects of that?
I think when you see that, when you either see them propolizing it at the top or ignoring it at the top, then when you do your second round, you should put it in the middle of the nest.
Okay.
Right, between the two brood boxes. Hopefully they won't do that. Pedro?
As far as, I've already done, Ipcard, so that if I have to treat again, do I want to go with Foreign Pro because of the weather or what? time, you know, the temperature.
Right. Well, what I've kind of been recommending is if you have high mite counts, if you have a lot of capped brood, to consider Formic Pro, because they're saying that for every mite that we see theoretically or distributed in the colony, there are 5 in the brood cells, right? So if you've already treated and you have a high mite count, again, what I was saying to Kathy is, you know, maybe you want to give them a couple weeks of a break, feed them, try to get them, you know, supported again, and then do a treatment that's appropriate to what their brood is, I think. So colonies that have capped brood, the Formic Pro is the only thing that penetrates capped brood. And yes, we're kind of running out of time, and with cooler temperatures, Apogard doesn't work as effectively as it does when it's 85 degrees. So I would look at the amount of brood and the temperature and how much time we have to treat.
And I think you said before that you really don't want to treat and feed at the same time, because you want to concentrate on the treatment. Is that right? Even with the Formic Pro.
Yes, with any treatment, when you feed, it's really, there's no chemical reaction. There's not an issue of that. It's really that you're distracting them from the treatment. Especially with Apogard, they're supposed to get in that material and get it on their bodies and then go touch everybody else. That's one way it gets distributed. And if you're feeding and your treatment's down here and they're all up at the feeder, they're not getting the full treatment.
How does that work? How do they, like, when they get it on them, how does that kill the mites that are on there?
Well, it's on the bee's body and touching the mite, and it doesn't happen immediately, but the chemical does kill the mite over time. They say, I think, 10 days. Well, that's with OA. I'm not sure with Apogard.
Just because it's touching their feet? I mean, how does it get over?
Well, the mites are attached to the bee, and if the bee gets it on their body and then it dries and it crystallizes, at that point, I think that's when it's toxic to the mites.
Okay.
So it's a fumigant, but they also need to distribute it and come in contact. And I just read something where they were using a different thing. They were trying to see how quickly foraging bees distribute food within the hive. So they colored it with not radioactive, but a feed that they could, shine a light on the bees and see. And within 6 minutes, 65% of the bees had this feed in them. So I mean, the foragers come in and they hand this off, or the queen pheromones. That stuff gets distributed very quickly. So I think I've mentioned to folks, give it like 3 days, a good solid 3 or 4 days for the treatment to do its thing. And then if if they're really light, feed them after 4 days. I think the Apogard should be evaporated by then.
No, I've seen it gone in 2-3
Yeah.
days.
Yeah,
Depending on how hot it is, it's so don't open the hive to feed them. I wouldn't disturb them, but as far as them getting in that tray, that's done in just a few days, and then you can start feeding.
What do you know about this new Apistan?
New Apastan?
Is
Oh, yeah,
there
there's
anybody use it?
Apivar has a quick strip, and I was talking to people when I was at EAS, and I think they were kind of poo-pooing it, but I don't know why. I don't know that it's a different formulation. Is it?
Well, I just see ads in the magazine. It's what it's the first thing we ever had 20 years ago to treat the raw mites. Apistan. Just do it.
Apivar is the brand name. So you're,
Fluvalidate is the name.
no,
Wasn't that-
well, no, Apistan is Apivar, and that's what's currently being used. And they've come out with a quick strip instead of, the problem with Apivar, in my opinion, especially in the springtime, is how long it's in the hive. So it's in the hive for 42 days, and then you pull those strips out and you have to wait another 18 days or something like that. And it's like a full 56 days that you can't have supers on. So it's, there's no temperature concern, but it's in there for a long time. And maybe they did reformulate it, because I've been hearing for a number of years that there are as much as half of the mite. So apparently there's 2 strains of varroa mites, and one strain is now completely resistant to Emba. So maybe they did come up with a new
Yeah,
formulation.
it was fluvalinate, and what happened, supposed to take them out after 7 weeks. A lot of beekeepers, well, some didn't do that. So it got weaker and weaker, then the mites got immune to that weak chemical, and they were just resistant to it. That's how we had to change to something else.
I remember when he was president of the EMBA 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, we were meeting at Kirkwood, and every meeting was, okay, what are people using for mite treatment?
Right.
What's working? What isn't working anymore? What's being developed? And so I remember when Emba came out, and that's been probably 16, 18 years.
Oh, gosh, this whole thing started in the early 90s, about 20 years.
Anybody else have any questions about feeding, or, there's an issue that we're gonna kind of address at the meeting next month in October. Our speaker is gonna be joining us via Zoom, and he presented at the Eastern Apiculture Conference on something called a condensing hive, which is kind of a whole other approach to insulating, to how bees use moisture in the hive, because I know that it's, I hear this question a lot, is should we wrap or insulate hives? So that's a wintering topic that we'll address in quite a bit with the meeting next month in October. Okay, well, I think we're going to turn it over to Dan. Don.
So I just wanted to take a few minutes to bring to everyone's attention, back in the back, there were a lot of forms, a lot of which pertain to the mead making. And there's this half sheet talking about the elections that will be coming up in November for the EMBA. As a long-serving board member, I've probably been on the board for probably 15 years. And when I first joined the club, I think the only 2 members that were members then that are members now will probably be Jane and Bob Faith, who were just up here. The club was tiny. We probably had 15 people in the club. And because of new blood being interjected into the club, we had new ideas, new ways of doing things, and the club has grown tremendously. So we've had a big change in the club this past year. Things are starting to rebound. A lot of the board members that were present have either moved out of state or no longer are active for one reason or another. So it's important that we get kind of back on track. And so according to the bylaws, which are being kind of gone over also, and we'll be voting on those in November, board members, will also be elected in November. And so this ballot list here shows the positions that our club will be having. President, vice president, secretary, treasurer. Those are, kind of descriptive. I mean, most people realize what those roles are. And then we have a website coordinator and social media coordinator, program chairperson, and then communications coordinator. So some of these positions, the president, we were very, very fortunate that when the old president, Bob Steers, was unable to continue with the club, that Dan kind of stepped up at a meeting that we had trying to reorganize the club and wanted to act as interim president. So that really helped us by his volunteering to do that. It really helped everything in the club kind of take off. Jane was key in getting us this facility. There were a lot of other people. Janet with the website, getting the website up and running. So all these people kind of came up, Melissa and Tom, they also kind of came into the group and really helped us get organized. And so I guess my point for being up here today is just to say that we need everyone to become invested in the club. And it's going to be important as we develop a ballot for this coming November's election, that we have people on that ballot so we can continue our work and continue to get things done. I remember when I was first asked to be on the board, you know, I was like a second-year beekeeper. So I didn't, you weren't at a very high level of beekeeping. That wasn't what was necessary. Having someone who was motivated to try to help the club move forward, to volunteer to do things if needed, and to come on a monthly basis to meetings to get organized and kind of help the club was what drew me to that opportunity. And so I feel that I really benefited as a board member by being involved with a lot of other key people in the club, being able to be involved with the events that were going on, to be having people like Bob Fink and Ted Jansen, who's passed, these big name beekeepers in our club, having them right there where I could ask questions, talk about things, kind of talk about our beekeeping. And it was really a benefit to me, when I first started out. So everyone hopefully picked up one of these. I would just ask that you think about, your availability to see if it's something that you would be available to help out the club with. There's a box in the back. I've got a list of all the specific details on what each job entails. For the president, they're going to be leading the club, helping organize meetings, helping kind of direct the direction of the club. The vice president basically fills those roles if the president is not available and helps with any other thing that the club needs. The secretary, when we have meetings, when we have especially board meetings and directors meetings, to take notes to help familiarize everyone with what we discussed the last meeting, so we have the minutes. The treasurer, keeping track of all the other financial statements and everything that the club needs to be kept track of. The website coordinator. Now Janet's been amazing at doing this and getting the club's website up and running. The program chairperson, that's someone who, with the help of others, will kind of make sure that we have speakers, that we have an event, location. And so that's what that role basically is. And then the communications coordinator is someone who helps with email prep, sends email blasts out to members, kind of helps compose those and helps do that. So we all have different talents. Some of you may be very tech savvy and can really help with some of these roles. So strongly consider putting your name and contact information on here. And as you depart, if you could put it in that box back there, that'll help us as we prepare to get a ballot organized for November's meeting. Any questions? So the terms, to meet the terms, as far as I know, are going to be 2 years, a rotating 2-year term. It used to be 1 year, and there was a feeling that in 1 year you're barely getting things moving, and so if you stayed for 2 years, that you'd have a better opportunity to make a bigger impact with the club and familiarize yourself with what's going on. For a lot of people, I hear, well, I'm kind of out of touch with what is going on. I'm not in the loop. But that's easy enough to change. I mean, Tom and Melissa and Janet, they weren't in the loop either. And they just came to an organizational meeting and kind of raised their hand when we were asking for volunteers and then said, what can we do? And we mentioned some things. They were happy to volunteer and help us get the ball rolling and get moving in the right direction. So any other questions? Okay. All right. I'll turn it over to Dan. Thanks, everybody.
Here it is.
Thanks, John. And just remember, if you won't be alone in any of the positions that you would volunteer for. You're not alone. I volunteered to be the president and have gotten all kinds of help, professional and otherwise. So just consider it your strengths, your time, and please volunteer. All right. I wanted to take a minute to recognize the folks who actually won a ribbon of some sort in the state fair. There are lots of different categories. Several people won more than one time, but I just want to mention the names. And you can probably find a list somewhere of all the categories and everything, right, on the website. Do we still have that? So you can see exactly who won what. But Ken Heitkamp and Michael Godfrey, Amy Venturella, if I'm saying names incorrectly, I apologize. Rick Falter, did I say it right?
Yep.
Okay. Brent Ricci, Denise Rosler Cunningham, William Barr, John Hillard, Mary Ellen Raymond, and Justine Hefner. So congratulations to all of you folks. Your participation in your entries and those who helped down at the fair and all that good stuff. So that's the kind of stuff that makes the club a good thing to be a part of. Also tonight then, we are going to learn about mead making, and there's a form back there to put a bid on all this stuff. Now there's some of this stuff that's, can you differentiate? You will?
Most of the stuff on the table, nothing over here. I think most of the stuff that's over there, minus a couple admin things that Ken and I brought, are included. So most of the big key items, probably the more expensive items being the floor corker and these big carboys and that big fermenter. Those are probably the big ticket items, but everything that you would need more or less, minus a few smaller things to start the process.
Great. And these were donated by one of our club members. Is there anybody interested in like making a proposal bid on all of this stuff to get started in mead making?
Not yet.
And yeah, you wait, you just wait until they're done with this presentation. You will be excited, for sure. Yes, sir.
It'll all be sold as a pack or?
Yeah,
as a
it's one lot, one lot. And please be ready to take it home this evening, all right? Yes,
What's the suggested value on that?
the value is probably about $300 worth of stuff here.
Easily, every bit of it.
Yeah.
I would say there's 99.8% of items you need to make needs sitting on that table. There's stuff on that table that I didn't get for 5-6 years of making mead, and that's up there right now. So that whoever bids on that, that's going to be a steal. I can tell you that right now.
Does it come with free lessons from the?
We're gonna
I want free lessons from the masters here.
Yeah, whoever wants to get it, if you have problems, call me and I'll sort it out. It has to go tonight, though. It has to go.
You want us to bid on it or fill out a thing?
Fill out one
Fill out
of these,
the thing and then we
and
give it to the
we'll
high school.
have some time at the end to go through them, and whoever, it's silent auction, basically. We'll go from there. Any other questions on all this? No? Okay.
Does everybody have a bid sheet or should I pass them around?
Pass them around, Jay. Pass them around.
All right, many of you were at the picnic, and that was a good day. And a lot of mead was sampled. Some of you sampled more than others. And that's okay. But tonight, we're going to have John Pasha and Ken Heitkamp, two longtime beekeepers, so long that it drove them to drinking. It's a mead. So they are going to give us this presentation this evening. I've made some mead. It's fun. It's tasty. I think you'll enjoy it. It's a way to use some honey if you got some extra honey too, and not a whole lot, really, does it? Not a whole lot, depending on how much you make. But I think you make beer with it, Michael? Michael makes beer with it. So lots of opportunities there, and I'm going to turn it over to Ken and John. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So as we begin, there were handouts in the back. Hopefully everyone got a copy of these. Ken is going to reference those sheets on the screen. Some of this I'll go over in detail, and some of this I'll assume that you guys know what a turkey baster is or what a measuring spoon is. And so I don't need to go into a lot of detail on those items. But the first page, hopefully he pulls up, is this one here where the top line is bottling the wine. And so there's some information I'm going to go over there. But for anyone who's new, so mead is probably one of the oldest alcoholic beverages known to mankind. Okay, so we all know that ripe honey won't go bad, but if honey has too much moisture, what happens to it? It ferments. Okay, so before we were able to have sealable containers that kept things airtight, honey will gradually pull moisture to itself. Okay, and so as the moisture content gets higher and higher, the risk for fermentation increases. And so I can remember taking a very interesting elective course in school on Nordic mythology and reading the different stories about mead halls and drinking mead from a mead horn and thinking, this is just fantastic. I've got to try some of this stuff. Then I became a beekeeper and decided after I went to Bob Fink's mead making class, I'm going to try to make it. And that was, I don't know, 12 or 15 years ago. And really enjoyed the process and really enjoyed making it. And so just like grape wine, there's a wide variety of flavors and sweetness levels and dryness levels that you can get from making mead. People always assume that because it's honey, that it's really sweet, and that's not always the case. So if you're going to make mead, we have a list of kind of a list of equipment that you should probably think about getting. Most of this isn't terribly expensive, but like all hobbies, it's not very long before, it all adds up. And so your bigger expense items, are these big, what we call carboys, okay? These are glass. These are nice because they've added these handles, which make picking these up a lot easier. When these are full, it's very treacherous to move around very much with one of these, because if you slip and this goes to the ground, you've got an amazingly large mess to clean up of sticky honey water, basically.
And these are very fragile. I've hit two of these together once, and it just cracked. It split one all the way up. So be very careful when you're cleaning them that you don't ching them together because they can break very easily.
Exactly. So going down this list, a scale for measuring things, digital scales are the best for that. A primary fermentation container, okay, a 7 to a 10 gallon bucket. You're going to need excessive space. If you're making a 5 gallon batch, you need more than a 5 gallon bucket because as you are fermenting this, it expands and kind of foams up at times, and so you have to have a larger bucket. So these buckets, there's nothing crazy different about this bucket except that it has a grommet in the top to accept an airlock, okay? The airlock, there's different shapes and sizes, but this is one type, and you basically have a level here that you put sanitizing liquid, or people sometimes put vodka or something there, and as the carbon dioxide through fermentation comes up, it acts like a trap and then will allow the air to escape, but oxygen can't get back into your mixture. A hydrometer and test tube, you want to talk about fragile. If you breathe on this wrong, it'll break. So there's a tube, and inside are the directions, and it looks like kind of like a thermometer. And there's a weighted bottom to it. And this is what you use to determine your specific gravity. And so I typically use a turkey baster. And you've got, see, this is nicer than what I have. I just use that. And take a sample, fill this up, and when you put this in, it's going to measure on here and it'll tell you your gravity. So as we go through the recipes, I'll let you put that back so I don't break that in half.
And when you buy one of these, make sure you keep this tube because it's really important to keep it into something, to keep it safe.
And they're not expensive, but $6 or $7, something like that. A large spoon, a racking tube, which is what this is. Racking is the process by which you move fluid from one container to another container. Okay, and we'll explain why in a little bit here. Funnels, measuring spoons, a turkey baster, 2 5-gallon carboys, a 1-gallon glass jug, a half-a-gallon glass jug if you've got access to those. Smaller bottles if you have. Yeah. And the reason for that will become clear in a little bit here. Measuring cups, a dowel rod for stirring, and these tight. You have a very small neck here, so when you're trying to stir, you have to have something pretty small. Airlocks, rubber stoppers for the bigger containers. This rubber bung will go in these jars or in these carboys, depending on the size of that. Hand sprayer for sanitizing spray. A bottle rinser, which that's what this is for.
Screws under your faucet, and when this pushes down, it shoots water up. Turn your bottles upside down. And
It's guaranteed not to make a mess in your kitchen.
Yes. We'll do that.
Yeah, I just use mine under the sink, and then there's a bottle brush. So there's a couple different bottle brushes. That one's for carboys, for cleaning these, and then there's different styles and shapes for whatever you're trying to clean and get access to. Let's see, a shut-off tube for filling bottles, which is right here. This is an amazing invention.
Very important.
This is a spring-loaded stopper. So when you're transferring, when you're all done and you're going to bottle your mead, you would have an empty bottle. You would have your mead elevated. You would have your bottles like down on the floor, and you would attach the end of this hose to this. Okay, so that whenever you build you have to have this, when you're transferring the fluid, you have to relieve the pressure and push this down. Otherwise, it's blocked off. It's like trying to siphon something and the hose is clogged off. So you have to have this down. You begin the suction, and then whenever you are filling the bottle, as soon as you lift up on it, it stops the flow. Okay, and so the diameter and the length and size, this is made so that whenever you are letting the bottle fill, as it gets just to the top, you stop. And when you remove this, the volume of this allows you to have just the right amount of room to put your cork and have just enough of an air space. So that's one of those things that, do you have to have it? No. Can you eyeball it and try to stop it by kicking the hose?
Good luck. This is one thing I would definitely buy.
Yeah, I love
Because
mine.
once you get this filled right to the top and pull this out, it gives you the exact airspace here. If you don't have it and try to put your corks in, there's either going to be too much pressure and it's going to pop it up, or there's not going to be enough and it's going to sink them down. This keeps your corks almost in the exact position. This is well worth its money.
And it gives you consistency between your bottles as you're bottling. And then the last thing I think here is a bottle tree. When you're doing a 5-gallon batch, you're going to have approximately 25 bottles of, the 750 ml variety. And so you'll rinse these, sanitize these, and a bottle tree is just what it sounds like. It's you can buy them or you can make them, and with dowel pins or whatever, you can sanitize it, and then they're at like this kind of an angle, so you pour your bottles on and they all can drain out. And then they're ready for you when you're bottling all 25 bottles. Okay, and then at the bottom there, it looks like there's some additives. You're gonna need yeast. There's another page we're gonna go into about yeast. There's other cleaners like dual fine, where's your dual fine at? Oh, here it is, right here. Other chemicals that you'll need for the process. This is a two-step kind of a clarifier for your mead that I found works pretty well. So that's just some general instructions on the top about cleaning bottles, sanitizing your corks, and the bottom part here is just the list of all the equipment. So the chemicals that are mentioned, a lot of these are any wine store. I get most of my stuff from St. Louis Beer and Wine out in Lamp and Lantern Village.
Lamp and Lantern Center, it's at 141 Clayton Road.
Yeah, they've got everything you would need. I mean, back when I was making it, I mean, Amazon really wasn't even a thing yet, but I'm sure that most all this stuff you could probably buy from Amazon or wherever you go. Friar.
Yes, Miss Fenton's is called Missouri Malt and Mill.
Okay.
It's in Fenton, right, by the soccer park, which they have almost everything there too. I go there a lot instead of running up to 141 Clayton.
Friar Tuck's also has a small section of bottles and all kinds of stuff. But most of the chemicals last, it seems like forever. And they're, $4 or $5 depending on what size and what chemical you're getting. But you'll see a lot of different chemicals here. And some of the chemicals we both use and some of them he doesn't use. It just depends. As with anything in beekeeping, there's 100 ways of doing this. What is your next?
What do you want to that?
Let's go to, yeah, that's as good as anything. So we'll go to the next page, which is the Lalvin yeast profile page. So when we're making mead typically is thought of as just strictly water, honey, yeast, okay? Now, you can improve upon that, improve the mouthfeel, improve the balance of acidity and sweetness by adding different chemicals to that, okay? You can also add fruit or spices to different recipes, and I've got a few recipes in here that I've included. I've got several books here. I guess I'll mention what he's pulling the slide up. If I could only have one book on mead making, by far, I think the best book is by Ken Schramm. It's called The Complete Mead Maker. It's on one of those pages I've given you, okay? There was a book by Roger Morse. It's good, it's just not as good as the Ken Schramm. This is another book that I found interesting, Making Wild Wines and Meads. There's a whole list of recipes from using onions to, cloves and ginger and elderberries and marigolds. And I mean, there's all kinds of different wines you could make. Some are good for drinking, some for cooking. And so this gives you some inspiration on what you might try. And then I've got two more books here on melomels and the big book of mead recipes. So there's a lot of good literature out there. But if I was only going to buy one book, I think before I started making mead, I would read this back to front, and it will help you substantially in your comprehension on how things are working and why things are happening. So as we look at this list here, there are two main suppliers of yeast for winemaking that are common. I'm sure there's a bunch more, but these are the two more common ones. One's called Lalvin, and they're kind of in this kind of a grayish color container. And then there's Red Star, which is multicolored. Most of the recipes I see, Lalvin seems to be the more widely available type, and the yeast is like 99 cents. This one here was 59 cents, so it's cheap enough. But there's a variety of different yeast strains that you can see here. So depending on if you're making a recipe or trying to build your own recipe, it helps to know what fruit, what what spices, what you're trying to make. It'll give you a good idea by looking at a chart like this on what yeast strain you should probably look into using. So most of the recipes for mead making is Lalvin D47, okay? And if we look on the left-hand side, D47, dry whites, non-dry whites, blushes, all those have 4 X's, meaning that that's the best you can get, okay? And so if you were doing something in one of my other recipes that I did, what was it? There was KP 116. When I did my recipe for my Christmas methomel, I used EC 1118, okay, which is all the way on the right. And I was using some citrus in that. I was using some honey. And so I decided to use the one on the right. Could I have used D47? Sure. I mean, you could try it and just see what works. A lot of what I'll recommend is that you take good notes when you're making a recipe, because it's going to take a while for you to have a finished product. And it's good that you can, go back to your notes and decide, 9 months later to find out what you did. If you want to tweak your recipe, it's good that you have those notes so that you can modify and change things. Yes, sir.
So I have a question. So if you're trying something new on here, and obviously you're starting off, that's what everything's gonna be, right? Do you always do a 5-gallon?
No.
So you might do
I usually, if it's something I'm unfamiliar with, and I always tell people, start off with a recipe. Because in reality, if you start today, you're not going to have a drinkable product for at least a year, okay? And so a 5-gallon batch, we haven't gotten to the main recipe yet, but that's 14 3/4 pounds, and then use another pound later. So you got 15, 16 pounds of honey, so you got about 1.5 gallons of honey in it, okay? And when you're a new beekeeper, to invest 1.5 gallons of honey in something that you're not sure you're even gonna like, or that you're gonna be successful with, is quite an investment. If you have 1,000 pounds of honey, then you might not think 15, 16 pounds of honey is that much to risk. So I usually do 1-gallon batches on some of these smaller things. And so I was telling Jane, it's not a funny story, but it was kind of funny. So this is a 2-gallon bucket. I used to bring buckets to the meetings here all the time. I probably bought 1,000 buckets here over the years. This is a 2-gallon primary fermenter that I made just like this one. I just drilled a hole and put a grommet in it and put an airlock in it. And as long as the lid seals right, then you've got a primary fermenter for a smaller batch, okay? If I'm doing a 1-gallon batch, I needed something, so 1 gallon is about 3.8 liters. And so we were in Mexico. We had bought water at our resort in a 5-liter bottle. I thought, oh, that's gonna be perfect. That's more than I need for 1 gallon. And that way, when it's done fermenting, I can transfer or rack it into a big 1-gallon container, and I'll be golden. And my wife just was like, you're not taking that container home on the airplane. And so I hid it in my duffel bag. And as we were going through security to get on the plane, the security guard looks at me and goes like this. And my wife had a big smile on her face as she's going down the runway or the ramp. And they questioned it and then finally just said, you can go. So I've got my 5-liter container. But again, just drill the hole, put a grommet. You can get the grommets for 60 cents, and put an airlock in it. And as long as it seals, you've got a primary fermenter. So that's good for. I already had a handle on it too. So that's good for smaller batches if you want to try something. Because a lot of these recipes are.
How many 750 milliliter bottles is that?
What is it? 4 or 5, something like that. Yeah, because that's what it is initially, but that's not what it's going to be when you're bottling, because you're going to transfer it from the 5-liter to this, and you're going to leave behind everything that doesn't fit into that. And so then you're down to 1 gallon, which is only going to give you about 4 or 5 bottles, depending on if you have to rack it again. So, so yes, you can start off small, and for most 1-gallon recipes, you're only talking about an investment for about 3 pounds of honey for a semi-sweet mead. So I only put this up here just to show you that there's different yeast strains. Some excel at some fruits and grape varieties or honey varieties, and some don't. Some are, I don't think it mentions, yeah, alcohol tolerance at the very bottom. Some of these have a very high alcohol tolerance. So getting into wine mead making 101. So you have fermentable sugars. Not all sugars are fermentable, but honey is, and grape juice is, but some honeys or some, like let's say lactose is not, okay? So you have fermentable sugars, you add water, you add yeast, and then fermentation starts to take off, okay? Now, when the yeast consume the sugar, two things are a byproduct. It produces carbon dioxide. That's why this is necessary, okay? You've got to relieve that pressure, okay? And it also produces alcohol. And it's going to consume the alcohol or consume the sugars and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide until one of two things happens. Until it runs out of sugar, and then it just kind of stops because there's no more sugar to consume, and you're left with a fairly dry wine, or it's going to consume sugar and produce alcohol and CO2 until the alcohol content gets toxic enough, and then it quits. It kind of just, it doesn't kill it, but it just kind of makes it dormant because it's just too toxic. But there's still residual sugars left in the wine, and so you'll have some residual sweetness in that wine. And if you added more sugar or honey that was necessary, then you'll have even a sweeter wine. It just depends on how much you're adding to your batch. Okay, so that's why if you have a recipe to start off with, it really helps you kind of get an idea on where to begin. So that's really all I wanted to mention about the yeast strain. It's just something, a good guideline on kind of what to do.
If you're doing fruit in that, I usually use the EC118 when I add fruit to my meads. I do a lot of meads with fruit. I do use that one. I like the way it's very fast fermenting, and it's got a good alcohol content to it. So
Yeah.
it raises it to about 15%.
The alcohol tolerance is very good. So that mead won't stop at, let's say, 10% or 12%. It might go to 15, 16, 18% alcohol, which means it's got a kick, you know.
So does the alcohol tolerance moderate mean it'll be a drier?
Has nothing to do with dryer. Has everything to do with how much alcohol it can tolerate and keep doing its thing. Because once the level gets so high, then it's like toxic to the yeast, and the yeast just tap out.
If it's consuming the sugars though, that'd be drier though, right?
It all depends on what your recipe is. So if you were going to use a high alcohol tolerant yeast and you started off a recipe and added more sugar, then you're not going to have a dry wine because you're compensating for that. But that's where tweaking recipes, and the downside to making wine is that it just takes a while to find out if you like the end product. And so if you decided, oh, this is semi-sweet, I was really hoping for a sweet wine. Okay, the next time I do this, I'm going to add more honey. Well, now you're talking another year to find out if you've got everything to the way you want it. So that's where starting off with the recipe again is super handy. Yes, ma'am.
So, the way I'm understanding their question is, you start off with a certain amount of honey, sugar, and if it's only moderate, very good, you'll consume what's happening. When you say you add more, you add it at the beginning or you add it later in the process to sweeten more?
So I guess to clarify, all things equal, if I had 5 jars and I had the same amount of honey and the same amount of water, and I had 5 different yeast strains, each having a different tolerance, then yes, the higher alcohol resistant yeast strain would consume more sugar and it would be drier. But if I was going to use that at the outset, I would make sure that I had more fermentable sugars in here at the beginning, because I would know that that sugar content is going to be reduced substantially because the alcohol content will be allowed to go higher because of the yeast strain I'm using.
You can also backfill a mead at the very end as long as you've killed your yeast. Okay, so if you got done and you said, well, that's too dry, I want a little bit sweeter, you could put some more honey in there, okay, and sweeten it. So just by taste, when you're done, you can actually sweeten at the end, as long as you killed your yeast. So I'm gonna go talk about, because I don't kill my yeast yet. And then what happens if you don't kill yeast, but I'll talk about that later.
He's living on the edge.
Is that secondary fermentation?
Yes, I'm gonna go over that when we're done.
Yeah, so there's a chemical you can add called potassium sorbate. When everything, and it'll mention in this next slide we're gonna go to, we're gonna do that one, the main recipe next. Potassium sorbate is used to halt fermentation. So if you have a mead and you're happy with where it's at and the fermentation has ceased and your plan is to back sweeten it, if it's fairly dry and the yeast are still allowed to be active and you add more sugar and then you bottle it and confine it so that you no longer have one of these, you're risking an explosion of your wine bottle. Because if that wine, you add that sugar or that honey back, and then the yeast start chugging along and start producing CO2 and alcohol, the atmospheric pressure in the bottle will increase to the point where if you've ever had a bottle of champagne, bottles of champagne don't look like this, okay? There's a different shaped bottle because the atmospheric pressure of a carbonated wine is different in shape, so it's stronger, so it can withstand those pressures, okay? So you'll have corks blow out or the bottles will explode if there's too much pressure. And that's caused by the back sweetening if you don't kind of halt your yeast. But like I said, Ken lives on the edge.
Is that what bottle condition means when someone says this is not cask?
It's bottle conditioned.
It may be.
Beer does that, and you can carbonate it by putting sugar in it, and that's usually a corn sugar because it's non-fermentable. So that just basically gives you your carbonation.
Okay. So, all right. So this is the main recipe. This is the recipe that I got, and Ken and most people in the club have used. I kind of modified some things when I took Bob's recipe, and as a new mead maker, I didn't know what potassium, metabisulfite was. I wasn't a chemist. I didn't know what it was used for, so I started doing some research. When I was looking at the recipe, add malic acid, add potassium bicarbonate, potassium metabisulfite. I was wondering to myself, what do these things do? Why am I adding them? And because in my mind, I'm thinking, well, mead is just water, honey, yeast. What's all this other stuff for? And so as I started reading this book and started looking into things, I just thought it'd be easier to clarify so that people understood this is to adjust the pH. This is used as a sanitizing agent. If you've ever seen a bottle of wine that you bought at the store, the back of it probably says contains sulfides on the back of it, okay? As you'll look down, in section 1, the last ingredient you add is potassium metabisulfite. Okay, it's a sanitizing agent. When you're investing, and Ken will disagree with me on this to a point, but if you're investing the time and money and honey into this, it depends on how much of a risk taker you are. It's a sanitizing agent. At the bottom of the page, there's a solution that tells you what you would need to mix to sanitize your equipment. So everything has to be cleaned inside of your carboys, inside of your bottles, all your tools, your hands, anything that's going to touch this mead needs to be sanitized. So you mix this stuff up in a spray bottle. It's super easy. Spray it. I pour some in the carboys, rinse it around. That's what I use. Now, there are other chemical options.
Yeah, this is the one, this is the new one that they have. It's called the one-step cleanser. Okay, you mix this up with one, so it's like 3 teaspoons or a teaspoon per gallon of warm water. And actually, this is a no rinse. You can actually clean your stuff out, set it up to dry, and you don't need to rinse it out or anything else. And this will sanitize. This is the new way they're going. You'll probably find this more than you will that old, this is the way they're going with everybody when you go buy this stuff right now. But everything, like he said, needs to be sanitized. I don't care what it is. If it's touching the mead, it needs to be sanitized when you're using it. Okay?
Because that's the risk, is that you're creating an ideal habitat for things to grow, and you want good things to grow and not something to contaminate this whole whole batch. So as I kind of go through this list here, this is going to be for a semi-Swede, what I would say just a straight up mead, okay? And the beginning picture, you don't have to go back, but it's got a light kind of a gold, kind of a yellowish color. The first slide that Ken had up there was probably one of this recipe.
Yeah, the big one was actually it's my original. This is what Bob Fink, he was the one that actually gave. So give credit to Bob because this was from his first class that he had, which I still have, but you can see all the stuff I have written all over it. But I still follow this thing. I still keep this and pull it out. So I did make a lot of adjustments to the recipe, but it's still one of the best recipes to get your regular mead ready to roll.
Is that the bottle behind you, Ken? The white bottle? Is it something?
No, this is a saffron. I didn't bring a regular, I had one, but it wasn't labeled. So I do have some, but I didn't have them labeled.
It's
But it will look like that.
yeah, it's a lighter color. It also, you know, I think on one of these pages I mentioned that when a recipe only has a handful of ingredients, the quality is really important. So if you used black locust honey for your 14 3/4 pounds, or you used, you know, the darkest honey you could find, that's going to make a big difference on how the flavor profile is on the meat, and the color is going to be impacted. And so, as with all wine, if we took a poll in here, there's some people who like really dry wines or really sweet wines, or that's going to be all across the board. And so that's important to consider. This is a good recipe. And then if you made this enough, you would probably tweak it to your own preferences. This is going to produce about 25 bottles. So by the time you're done drinking all that, you'll have a good idea as far as what you want to change.
Plus, I found out too, your lighter honeys will produce sort of a sweeter mead. Your darker honeys are much more floral. You get much more of a floral taste out of those meads if you use a darker honey. And I'm talking about a good quality dark honey, not just a, dark honey that came from out of the middle of the woods somewhere and has a funny taste to it. It has to still be a good tasting dark honey.
Yeah. If you don't like the flavor of it as a honey, you're probably not going to like the flavor of it as a mead. So looking at this recipe, going through this looks daunting initially, but when you have your stuff here, it doesn't take very long. All these steps are often separated by sometimes weeks between each one of these steps. So you're going to mix, and I'll stop again and say, honey water content varies. Some honey is very, very dry, 14, 15%. Some honey will be upper, 17, 18%. If I had any honey that was really wet, an alternative to drying that out would be to make some mead with it. Then I don't have to worry about it because I'm going to be adding water to it anyway. So if it's high moisture content honey, that's the best honey to make mead with, because then I don't have to worry about it. So 14 3/4 pounds, 4 3/4 of spring water. Can you use tap water? Sure. But again, with so few ingredients that you have, influence on, make sure it's the best water you can get. And then you're going to want to test the specific gravity, and it should be 1.090. And that seems really complicated. A lot of people are like, it's just you take your turkey baster, you put some of that in this container or, one of these containers, and then you just read on it and see where it's at. If it's not where it needs to be, then you're either going to add more water or more honey to get it to where that initial the initial specific gravity is. And then this always seems like an excessive amount of acid when I'm mixing this up the first time. But malic acid, usually you buy it in a bag or a bigger container.
They come in a container like this.
Yeah.
You get it in a container like this, or bigger.
Oh, here it is. Yeah.
You can get a bigger one, yeah.
It looks like crystals, and it's one of the, several major. We had citric acid, and there's malic acid, and there's, I forgot the other one. But one of them is like the acid that you get on the green apples. And anyway, that's what the recipe calls for. And then potassium bicarbonate, which is a buffer to adjust the pH. and then a quarter teaspoon of potassium metabisulfite. So that's a sanitizing agent for the must. And the idea is that if there's any wild yeast strains in the honey or in the mixture, when you're pouring this in your primary fermenter, that will sanitize and kill the wild yeast strains before you add your preferred yeast strain. So in this case, it's going to be the Lalvin D47. So it's going to come in a little packet just like this. So 24 hours later, then you can add your yeast. So you want that must to be sterilized with the potassium metabisulfite. And then we had a big laugh about this, Bob and I did several years ago, about he had really specific guidelines on how he rehydrates his yeast. And I take a small little container, and sometimes if I had a can of orange juice at the vending machine at work, I would take that home, open it up, pour it in, take my yeast, pour it in. After the orange juice came to room temperature, pour it in, put the yeast on top, cover it with a towel, put it in a warm spot, and 20, 30 minutes later, I'd come back and check on it. And almost all the time, you could tell it was working. And so I knew the yeast was rehydrating. So once it's activated, you pitch it into the must, stir it up good.
One step before that, I go into sort of talk about this. Once you get your mustard done, you need to get oxygen into this. So I bought one of these. Now I do sanitize all this before I use it. Put this on a drill and stir that stuff up, and it will get very foamy. And that's what you want before you pitch that yeast. You want it to have a lot of foam in it. You want a lot of oxygen in this, because that will make your fermentation go a lot quicker. You'll see it pretty quickly if you do that. If you don't do that, then you're going to have probably a slower fermentation or getting started.
Yeah. Initially, oxygen is your friend, and later in the recipe, oxygen is your enemy. Okay, so in order to get the fermentation up and running strongly, you need oxygen in here. You provided the sugars, you provided the yeast. So initially, that's going to start off, but honey doesn't have all of the nutrients that are required for fermentation. Okay, and so we're going to supplement the honey so that the yeast aren't stressed and providing off flavors. We want to make sure they have all the nutrients necessary to really get up and running. And so after 12 hours of fermentation, we're going to add 3.5 teaspoons of diammonium phosphate, okay, which is a nitrogen source and for fermentation.
And they make some different kinds. This is Fermate K, which is the same thing. You may have to, that's sort of hard to find now, but this is another one that they use all the time. Basically, all that's going to do is re-energize your yeast and get them really going. Okay.
Yeah. And so again, that takes 3 minutes to do that. And so as far as a time investment, there's a long, a year-long process. Most of that time is waiting for the next process to come in line. So 7 days after that, you're going to add your Fermate K, 3.5 teaspoons, and that causes it to foam up a little bit. So having it still in, it causes it to foam up a lot. Having it in this primary fermenter still, where you still have headspace, is a lot easier to do it here before you transfer it into there, okay? Because the idea is that these taper down with a very small neck, because you're going to want to not have a lot of air volume in here. You're going to want this liquid to be up pretty high so that you have very little oxygen, air surface area.
Those are all stirred in when you put those in, right? When
you stir it in.
You put that in there and start stirring one of these.
No,
and that's
not
gonna
that
foam
over
over.
there.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
still gonna foam up a lot.
It
You gotta be
does.
really careful with that, because it can foam over and make a mess.
Tap it in just a little at a time, and you'll see
Yeah.
it foam up,
A
and
little
you
bit
just
of
kind
a
of stir
little
it in.
time.
Can you purposely leave the level low and then add water after kind of?
If you're gonna do that, take some out of there and put it in a sanitized gallon jug, and then add your Fermate, and then pour that back into it. I would not add water after your must has already been
You're
done.
gonna have, what size is this? 10 gallons?
I think that goes up
Oh,
to
this is 6.5.
7.
No, that's 6.5 imperial. That's imperial gallons.
Yeah,
So
I
it's
have
like
one that
7
holds
gallons.
7 gallons. That'll hold 7 gallons.
Yeah, so 5 gallons of liquid only comes up to here.
Right.
So you're gonna have almost 5 gallons of water and you're gonna have a little more than a gallon of honey that you're adding. So you're gonna be a little higher. You just take your time. You're not in a big hurry, so just take your time and tap it in. And the airlock is going to be on here. And so when you take this lid off, you're gonna make sure that you're sanitizing it before you put it back on, anything that it touches. And when you take your lid off, if you flip it upside down, if there's any fluid, depending on the airlock style you have, your sanitizing fluid is going to come out of that. So you just got to be careful and pay attention. Yeah, these, I like these, but if you have an aggressive fermentation, these things will just be like nonstop. There's other styles that I saw that you use that I kind of like on the initial fermentation because it really gets going. So then we're going to racken and pre-sweeten. So
You put the ferment K in dry, or you activate it?
no, it's dry. You just tap it in, you measure it out, and then just tap it in, and it starts foaming, and you're just stirring the whole time, and it will foam up and then kind of just go back down again. So
Manual stir.
yes, I wouldn't.
Oh, no, yeah, not that. I'll
Not
use
that.
that to do my must.
Yeah,
By
just using
that
something.
time, mine are in my carboys already, so I take some liquid out of here when I put that in there, and I start, but you can't stir this real fast. You just barely stir this, man, it's just gonna start going. It's amazing how quick that's gonna come up into there. So if you don't take some out and you have this up to here, it's gonna be a mess. It's gonna flow, right? Bob, it's gonna come out of there and you're gonna get a quart of it laying on the ground, so just be careful with that.
That was one of the changes I made with Bob's recipes. I think that Bob had it going into this, and then you add your ferment K, and it's like you have, how much is it? 3.5 teaspoons, and you're using, 10 granules at a time, and it's foaming up, and it's like, well, just do it in here where you have 3 inches of headspace, and then you don't have to worry. At least that's the method that I've used. Is just do it in here first before I transfer it and rack it into my cardboard.
John, I always make my ferment in a little water.
Yeah, I mix mine too. I either take a little bit of this out, mix it.
My wife 16 like pint, and mix about 4 ounces, 5 ounces of water, and then I would pour little bits of it in the cardboard. But the first time I went El Vesuvio, I stopped. I went back.
See, yeah, take some out here.
You're making it too hard on yourself. So then we're gonna rack. So after a lot of fermentation is happening, you'll get sediment. You'll get yeast sediment, and there'll be sediment in here. And so once the majority of the fermentation is happening, then the vigorous fermentation that you're going to put into your secondary fermenter. And so after fermentation is complete, 4 to 6 weeks, and the specific gravity is 1.006. So again, you're using this again to check your gravity. And then you're going to rack the meat off of the sediment, and you're going to add, because we're exposing it again to the elements and transferring it to another container. They like to use potassium metabisulfite. Now Ken doesn't do that, and so he's had good success with that. It just, again, it depends on your risk level, whether or not you choose to skip that or to add it.
What's the downfall to not use that?
A lot of people get headaches from that can cause headaches. A lot of people drink wine, will not drink a sulfated wine because it gives them a headache. Plus, if you're going to do a second fermentation, I do not want to kill my yeasts that are in here. Okay, because I'm using my regular mead recipe and I get my fruit, and then my fruit gets added to that regular mead recipe. So I want that yeast still alive. So it goes through its second fermentation. Okay? So I don't kill it. And I don't kill it at the end either. I don't ever sulfate any of mine. I've never had it. Well, I've got one that's, if you're at the picnic, I do have one that was very bubbly, like a champagne. That was a pawpaw mead that I did. Very good, but
nice,
it does have pressure in the mouth. I've never had one blow up at my house. I put it back in my truck one time. I was traveling and they hit together and they did pop the corks off. It was all over the back of my truck. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. I racked my blackberry mead wine that I started, a few weeks back. So there was about this much sediment in the bottom of the carboy. So that went away. So how much yeast would be left?
There's still, well, you already put the fruit with it. So you added the fruit at the beginning fermentation?
Yes.
Oh, see, I never do that. So I don't know. I couldn't really tell you. I don't do it that way.
You still have yeast
Okay.
suspended in it.
If you didn't kill it, yeah, you're still gonna
No,
have
I
some kind of
didn't
yeast.
put anything in to kill it, but the bubbler is not doing anything. I mean, it's just there. The water's just level in it, there's no pressure.
It's sort of amazing when you do a second fermentation, you're not gonna get that big, because you're just putting a little bit more sugar from the fruit. You're using natural fruit. Still has sugar in it, but you're not gonna see a drastic bubble and everything else on there. But I'll talk about
So
that.
just let it go. It should still be good, huh?
Let it go, yes.
And if I would probably try it, a little sample, just to see, is it super dry? In other words, did it stop because the fermentation is just complete and there's no more sugar? Or is it really sweet and there's a possible yeast issue? But just because you rack it, you should still have yeast in there enough to continue the fermentation practice, with the sugars that are in it.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Is this way from one glass, you're wrapping it from one glass carboy to the second glass carboy?
Well, it can be, it depends what your primary fermenter, but in this scenario, you're removing it from your primary fermenter to your secondary fermenter. So from one plastic to one glass. We're going to be racking it one more time, and that's when you would go from glass to glass. At least that's the way that I do it. But and so you add these other chemicals to it. Potassium sorbate, as we talked about earlier, halts fermentation. So that's it. It's done. At that point, you could add a pound of honey, maybe more, but you want to get your specific gravity to up to about 1.014. Okay. Again, it depends on how sweet you like your wines. Then you're going to want to clear the mead. And so when I took the class from Bob back in the day, bentonite, option 2, bentonite and sparkleoid was what we used. And then they came out with dual fine, and I couldn't find.
That's so much better.
I couldn't find those two chemicals. And the guy at the wine store said, well, this is what everybody's using now. So I'm like, okay, then give me that. And that's what I've been using ever since. So the directions are on the back, but within a couple days, if everybody knows what a blue moon beer is, a really cloudy kind of, it turns it from that to Bud Light. I mean, it just, boom, everything comes out of it and it turns clear in a couple days. I mean, it's amazing what this, it's called dual fine.
It's the new stuff to use.
Yeah.
It will clear a mead up within 12 hours, overnight.
Yeah.
It'd be drastic. It's a drastic change.
It's amazing how much different it looks. And so then you wait a couple weeks, then rack it one more time off of the sediment, because everything that settles out of that mead, you want to transfer and get it off of this and into another mead, another carboy. And so if you put your excess, when you transferred it from here into this, chances are you're still going to have some more in this bucket. And so that's when filling a gallon or a half gallon, whatever size container you have, with the excess and putting an airlock on it, having that ready to go, so that when you transfer it from this carboy to this carboy, you're going to leave sediment behind. And so if it was this full here and you transfer it, you're going to be down, you're going to be lower because you're leaving some sediment and stuff behind. And so you can always top it off with what you have in these other carboys, the smaller 1 gallon and half gallon containers. That's where the use of those
When
comes
you
in.
do that, always siphon this into your thing first, and then siphon this, and whatever's left in here goes back in one of your bottles. That way you're mixing that together, and you're not leaving this all to the end that has been mixed in.
There you go. Then you can add potassium metabisulfite again, sanitizing agent, and then some malic acid again, 5.5 teaspoons. And a lot of times I remember thinking initially, man, it seems like an awful lot. But when it's all said and done, it turns out to be really nice.
Start tasting it at that time. It's really important when you're getting ready to bottle, you want to make sure that it tastes the way you like it. So you just remember this, you can't take it out once you put it in. If you put it in a little bit at a time, you say, okay, that's the way I like it. It's got it's got that mouthfeel. I'm stopping. I'm not going to put all that in. Just remember, if you put it all in and stir it up and you don't like it, well, you can't take it out. So start a little bit at a time at the end.
What is the effect on the flavor, or like you said, mouthfeel?
Well, like somewhat, it depends on what you like in a wine, your mouthfeel. So if you like it drier or, a little bit bitter, I oak all
Are
mine.
you talking about the acids or
The acid, well, I use an acid blend at the end.
yeah,
I use an acid blend.
so you can get what they call acid blend, which is a combination of citric acid. If you've got some, it probably will tell you. Oh, careful.
I don't know if I have.
So you can use that. If you decided I'm not going to use malic acid, I'm going to use citric acid, or I'm going to use acid blend. You can modify and change things. Then it says to let it age for 3 months, and you can sweeten with sugar if a sweeter mead is desired. So for clarity's sake, so that your wine stays clear, I typically use sugar, 3.5 teaspoons or something like that. I think is what I use, 2.5.
Liquid sugar.
No, just table sugar. Or you can make simple syrup, which is probably the easiest thing to do, and then just add that. That way you don't have to worry about it dissolving or all going to the bottom.
But think about it this way, you took all that time and had that honey in here that you used, and you're gonna go back and put sugar in this at the end? Absolutely not. You keep a little bit of your honey that you put in here. If you're gonna sweeten it, you're gonna put honey back in here. Why would you put sugar in a natural thing? That's what we're gonna do.
Enough said.
For clarity's sake, so that it stays clearer, I find that it just is a little clearer and doesn't get
Put it in before you
the
suss it
sediment.
up.
Does this take 6 months total?
A year.
Oh,
Before I bottle it, it sits in one of these a
So
year.
it's gonna take, you're gonna let it age for 3 months, and then you're gonna bottle it. And once you bottle it, you don't wanna bottle it and then open it up and try to drink it. It needs to age. It needs,
Another
trust
6
me, it
months?
needs to mellow out.
okay.
It
needs
will
to
definitely
mellow.
mellow.
Okay.
If you're at the picnic, you're gonna, some of those meats I had were from 2018.
I brought one from 2010.
Yeah, so I mean, and it actually gets better with time, believe it or not. We had one, Jane, what, was that a 20-year-old bottle we had? That guy
Yeah,
gave you? It
that
was
was a
20
couple
years
years
old,
ago.
wasn't it? It was
Yeah.
unbelievable. Still very drinkable.
So it makes,
20 years.
but I would say at least a year. You'd probably want to wait, or at least 6 months, and then try one and see what you think. And if you think it's perfect, then drink it up.
Right, then it's ready to roll. When it's good for you, then it's good to go.
Yeah. But the process, each step, I mean, it seems really elaborate here, but each step takes, after you get the initial setup in your primary fermenter, it's 20 minutes on a Saturday, to get to the next step, and then you're waiting. And I feel bad to say this, but I had about nine 1-gallon batches and a couple 2-gallon batches and stuff. And life gets busy. And I had brown paper sacks because the window, there was sun. I thought, I don't want any sun to interfere with anything. Sacks upside down on top of everything. And, I'm going to get to that one of these days. I want to get back there and rack this stuff. And then a month turns into 6 months. And I'm going to go do that. And I went down and all the airlocks had dried up and everything was bad. So all that work was just down the drain.
Very important that you keep an eye on your airlocks.
Yeah.
You don't want that to happen.
Had I monitored this more diligently, I wouldn't have had that issue. But
So the wine ages in the bottle and you bottle it regardless of the final outcome at about 3 months?
that's usually about what it's, yeah. That's your last opportunity to taste the sample of it and think, okay, do I like it? Do I want it to be more sweet? And I actually take a few minutes. It's not like something I rush. I'll put some in a glass, try it. I'll put some in the glass and take it to my neighbor.
Yep.
What do you think about this? Does it need to be sweeter? Does it not? I'll set it down, come back in 10 minutes, try it again. How does it, how's my initial thoughts?
Well, how would you characterize the flavor at that point and the flavor at 1 year, 2 years later.
Some of those that you bottle early can taste sort of like mouthwash. Okay, and as it ages, it will mellow out tremendously.
I find it to be acidic, kind of a lot of acid in them initially, but that really mellows out. And that's why I'm saying if you bottle it, you don't want to turn around and start drinking it because you're going to want to let it sit for a little while. And then it's amazing. I did one, the recipe's on here for Viking's Blood. It's a cherry mellow. So if you have a mead, it's honey water yeast. If you add fruit to it, well, now you don't technically call it a mead. Now it's a mellow. And if you take a mead and you add spices to it, let's say you add cinnamon and nutmeg, something like that, then you've got a methylene, okay? And so the name of what the drink is technically called changes. And so I did one with some tart cherry juice, and we tried it at the, and I thought, man, this really is matured and really tastes a lot better than it did when I first tried it. I don't know, 2 years ago when I bottled it, something like that. So, so that's, again, it seems daunting initially when you first get the recipe, but there's nothing overly complex about it.
The most important aspect of making a mead is getting your fermentation going and going strong at the beginning. Okay, if you have a stuck fermentation and it's not bubbling, it's not doing what it's supposed to do after about 4 days, you may have to go in and put some more yeast in it. You may have to put something else in to get that fermentation going. I do mine in my basement. It's about 70 degrees down there, 73 maybe. Bob, I know you put a heat mat under some of yours, right? Did you have a heat?
I've had to do it in
About 70s.
It gets a little cold, I have a heater.
Oh, heater, okay.
This bucket actually has it's already got a thermometer on it. So that's nice.
But when you're making mead and if you had a good fermentation, this thing's gonna be bubbling quite profusely.
Yeah.
And if you have 2 or 3 of those in your basement, your whole house can smell like mead. It's sort of, my wife knows exactly when I'm making my mead because the whole house gets to smell like we're making wine downstairs, so.
I would say for every person's experience will be different. But if I mix this up after I get off of work, when I wake up the next morning, I'll hear that bubbling. So, I mean, when I add the yeast, usually the next day, 24, it's not even been 24 hours, it's been basically 12 hours. I'll hear it bubbling and you'll see the air bubbles and usually you can hear it. Boop, 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 boop. You'll keep hearing that and that's this thing going to town. Again, this style is good, I think, for the smaller batches. I like the other style better for these big 5-gallon batches. I think it handles the amount of carbon dioxide a little better. I don't know how we're doing on time. But the next, I guess we'll go to that. So the next page, it's got the 2 wine books at the bottom. So I think it's really nice if you make a mead and you decide this is really cool, I like doing this. If you have access to blackberries, which are pretty common in this area, Ken had pawpaws, and you make all kinds of stuff. I mean, I've made plum, and this is boysenberry, and using local ingredients that you can get access to, usually that are pretty abundant. To me, that's nice if you can do that. Some fruits, blackberries in particular, I find that if you freeze them before you use them, it helps burst all the little individual cells and there's a lot more juice available. But blackberries provide a lot of acid. And so it's important that you try that to see how, because if it's super acidic and tart, you have to take that into consideration when you're working on your recipe, that you're not getting something, way too tart. And so that's something to consider. If you're purchasing fruit juice like I did for my cherry one, take a look at the ingredients. You don't want something with preservatives in it because those are in there to fight fermentation or to keep it from going bad. And so that's going to work against your yeast that you're trying to get active in your mead. I already mentioned 3 pounds of honey is a good starting point for a semi-sweet. Take good notes. Freezing your fruit, important of sanitizing your must. We talked about that. Pectic enzyme. There's like a certain haziness that comes when you use certain fruits with a lot of pectin. And there's
If you look in the bottom of this, you can see a little bit of the pectin at the bottom. It's not gonna hurt you. I don't put that pectin enzyme in there. If you do strawberries, though, if you ever use the strawberry one, you need it because the little fine hairs just get in, and then you'll never get a clear mead. But I really don't use that in any of my other berry meads. You'll get a little bit of stuff in the bottom, but it's not gonna really deter from the mead at all.
It doesn't, I don't care how long it seems like I let my meat sit. You'll get sediment. I mean, it looks as clear as can be, and then you'll come back after it sits for a year, and you look at the bottom of your bottle and think, golly, I thought I had it clean enough, or clear enough. But again, before I serve it to anybody, I just shake the bottle a couple times, and then nobody knows it's there.
Can you filter any of that out?
You
Bob
can.
bought he bought a
make
filter.
filters.
They make a filter, but
I bought one of those fancy filters.
Doesn't look that good, does it, Bob?
Help it too much. It was kind of a mess. I'll give it to anybody that wants it. I haven't used it for 10 years.
yeah, I remember when you got it, but it's like, I won't mess with it. I mean, to me, it's not that big of a nuisance that it's worth messing with. Some of these recipes that you see, you'll see people using like strong tea. Boil some strong tea bags and add that, and you're getting tannins for a mouthfeel by adding that. Some people will add raisins, chopped up raisins, and that's going to be a yeast nutrient that you can add to your recipe. I guess a natural yeast, raisins, of course, are just dried up grapes, and so they have some nutrients in there. Citrus peel, using the peel and not the pith is important. You can use the juice for acidity. I already mentioned black tea for tannins for better mouthfeel. We talked about yeast strains and being patient. And so these two recipes, one of the recipes on the left, on your left, is from City Steading Brews. If you go to YouTube, their YouTube channel, tons of information, tons of mead making tutorials, recipes, ideas. That's something that they made that I thought was interesting. And then I made the Viking blood on the right, using some tart cherry juice. If you like cherries, you like cherry juice, you don't want to use sweet cherry juice. You have to use tart cherry juice because the sweet cherry juice, although it seems like sweet meat that's got sugar in it, and sugar is what I'm trying to ferment, and so this will work all towards my advantage. It gives the wine a Robitussin flavor, and that's not ideal. So the OG and FG, OG is not what you think it is. That's the original gravity and the final gravity. And you can subtract the final gravity reading using this. You can subtract the final gravity from your original starting gravity, and that you can, there's a formula that you can determine to find out what your alcohol content is.
It's right here. It's your ABV is your initial gravity minus your final gravity times 131.25. That will give you your alcohol content. It's very important to watch that, and you should have about a 100-point drop in your gravity, somewhere around 100. I guess they always 100. Some of mine are in the 88s, some of them are 90s, but you want at least that kind of a drop in there to show that you got that your alcohol, that your yeast is taken on and use that sugar up. Okay.
Yeah, and when you look at the top of this page, with what Ken just said, it makes sense. So 3 pounds of honey per gallon of water is for a semi-sweet. That's 30, each pound is 35 points on your hydrometer. Okay, so 3 pounds, each being 35 pounds. If you're wanting a 100 point drop, you're using a majority of that sugar up in that honey. And so again, you can tinker with these recipes, change them around. And the last page is the Christmas holiday methomel. So a methomel is a combination of a melomel and a methicillin. So you're using fruits and you're also adding spices. So this is something that I kind of have made a couple times now that I really like. It's great around a campfire in the fall or winter. It's got a lot of different, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, brown sugar, orange juice, apples, raisins, cranberries, water, and then dark honey. I like to use dark honey in this. And again, it's just, to me, it's a fantastic for around a campfire. A couple other things I thought I would show. This is a tool that I made to me, one of the most fun aspects of making mead is once it's almost done, is making the labels. You can come up with some pretty cool labels. And so this is made so that when I'm bottling and labeling my wine, that this will sit, and all my labels will be, and I'll have a nice flat surface to put my level label on and wrap it around, and all my labels are consistent across the board. And if I have 375 milliliter bottles, and I use this side. So depending on what I don't have any OCD.
When you want perfection, you do that one, John.
What's your advice on how much honey? I've got something that tastes like rocket fuel, but I thought, oh, more honey would make it.
Just remember, if you don't like the honey, it's probably not gonna make a good mead that you want to drink. The honey's not tastable, if it's not something that you like the flavor of, I don't know if I'd be wasting my time making a mead with it. Because you're gonna put a lot of time into this.
Again, if you've got the extra equipment, try it, make a smaller batch, try it. And
Well, so
three
5 pounds of honey.
for a semi-sweet, 3 pounds per gallon of water will get you a good starting point. If you typically like sweeter wines, then I would say put 3.5 pounds in.
Well, doesn't that sweetness disappear? I mean, the fermentation takes that out. The sweetness out.
To a point.
The yeast are gonna take it to an alcohol content, and then they're gonna shut down. So if you still have that sweeter in there, it's still gonna be a sweeter wine, because they only go to a certain point where the alcohol builds up, and then they shut off.
Before we get any more questions, Dan, before you leave, anyone who is interested in putting a bid in before we conclude, does anyone need a pen or a form or anything like that before we?
I'll be here, step out.
Okay.
Yeah. There's no things back here. I have one.
The solar wax melter is that machine right there that we're getting rid of too, that was donated. Everything that's there goes with that solar wax melter. That's to wax your that's to melt your wax cappings out in the sun.
Yeah. The top opens up. Put one of these big aluminum trays in it. From the best I can understand, you put your dirty wax in it, and you'd probably want to put a hole in the end of it so that your wax that melts can drip out of it into a loaf pan like this that you put right in here, and that catches all your wax that melts and leaves the majority of your debris and stuff up in that right up here. Oh, corking, bottling. So we didn't talk about bottling. So there's this kit includes. Is this yours?
No, that goes with it. No, sir.
Okay, so 2 hand corkers, which is overly redundant when you have this. This by far is the easiest way to cork wine. The idea is that you sanitize your corks. Let me set it here.
The bottles go in there like that. Put your cork right in here. Push that lever down, and it will.
Let me raise this up a second. So there's a die that compresses right up here. When you pull this handle down, this die just closes in. And so you put your cork. I tend to use synthetic corks.
And I use natural corks.
Pros and cons. Synthetic corks don't need the contact of the wine on the cork to remain full. And so I can store my wine vertical and not have any kind of an issue.
Mine are upside down.
So it just, it depends what you like. So,
Which one of you guys is right?
yeah. So this is, so you have your wine racked. We talked about this bottle filler, and you stop it right before it comes to the tippy top. And then you would have, hopefully, ideally, you have an extra set of hands, because bottling is a lot easier with two people. And somebody is, you lift this up out of the bottle, it stops, your next bottle goes in, you pass that bottle off, you get the next bottle, so you're right here, and then you cork it. And so this is spring loaded. You just lower this down, put your bottle there, and it kind of locks into place. And you put your cork in here, and as you compress this, it squeezes that cork to a little bit bigger than a pencil. And so I find that when I'm doing this, you get it, I usually put my foot on it, and I get it to the point where it's pretty well compressed, and then it's boom, into it fast. If you don't, it's going to have the cork not go as far as it needs to go. So you have to be quick with it. It's got an adjustment. This adjustment here, this screw will dictate how far in this goes, how much of a gap you have here at the top of your bottle. So I've never used the hand corkers. I'm sure they work fine. But this would be the Cadillac of bottling, and so I just
Used them before? I mean, when you buy a kit, this is usually what you get first. That's an extra there.
yeah, these things. This alone is probably upwards of $100.
Yeah, that's $65, $70 just for that piece of equipment.
So it hasn't risen as much as I thought it would have by now when I bought mine. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
Real quick, I'm gonna talk about oaking because I oak all my meads. So when I make my meads, I make my regular recipe and I get my meads done. I usually start these in December. So that around March or April, I will oak my meads. So these are in my carboys. I take about 4 to 5 ounces of these chips. Now you can buy, these are American oak. They come light. So that they actually toast them. I use light toasted. You can get a heavy toasted or you can get them untoasted. Okay, so I use a light. What that's going to do is put tannin into your wine. It gives it much more of a mouthfeel like a wine. Okay. Once I get my regular meads all ready, I wait for the fruit to come in. So I do a lot of blackberry. I do elderberry. I do tart cherry. I've done peaches. So you just want to find somebody in the area that, I had peaches in my yard. I made a delicious peach mead one year. Of course, I don't have peaches anymore, so they were hard to find this year. But you go to the farmers markets if you can find somebody's got blackberries, because they have a lot of waste. Some of them are not even good to, if you talk to them, they go, oh, I can't sell. I got ones at home, they'll sell me a 5-gallon bucket full of them for next to nothing because they're smaller and that, but they're great for making a mead with. I get tart cherries out of North Michigan. I order them from up there every year. The tartar the fruit, the better the mead it's going to make. You want a tart fruit for a mead. So when you're using cherries and that, or I get tame elderberries from somebody, and I went and I picked wild ones. And you wouldn't believe the difference in taste between a tame elderberry and a wild elderberry. The wild ones are much more tartar. They're much more smaller, but they make a much better mead than a grafted or cultivar elderberry. I do all mine on second fermentation, so they get poured back into one of these with my fruit. I will take like my elderberries, and I do warm them up. So I do get them about 100 degrees on the stove and smush them down, and then get them back in here with the seeds and everything in them. They will sit in here for probably 2.5 months, or back in my carboy, because I get them back into a carboy once after about 3 days, I'll put them back into a carboy. And I just let that fruit. So you had fruit sitting in yours, it can sit there a while. Okay. And then you want to check it, taste it, and see if you like it. Add any of your acids at the end. I use an acid blend. But I do not sulfate any of my wines. I never really kill on any of my meats. I never really kill my yeast at all, ever. And like I said, I just made a pawpaw one that's like a champagne. You open it up and it is fizzing. Don't tell me, they were still active and it sat in that carboy for probably 4 or 5 months before I even bottled it. And it still had enough in there that when it got into the bottle, it did fizz it and does it.
On your initial fermentation, the crud or the junk, that first, aren't you supposed to like get that out of there?
I rack mine probably 4 to 5 times before I'm done. But I make 7-gallon batches and I have a bunch of these filled up as I do it. So I always have enough to keep one of these filled. You want to keep this filled. You want very little air in these when they're done. You don't want to start filling it here because you got a lot of oxygen in there. You don't want to do that. You want to keep them full as possible. If you have to go to a smaller, a lot of mine, I'll make a 3-gallon batch. They make these in a 3-gallon jug, which would give you about 13 bottles. I get about 27 bottles out of one of these when I'm done.
Your initial fermentation, once it kind of quits bubbling, you want to get that out of there into a carboy?
I only leave mine in this for about 3 days and they go right into there. I don't leave this in here. Mine all ferment in these. After about 3 days, I get them out of this.
You don't add your fruit until
it comes into season or I get it. I have it all ready. So come springtime when the stuff starts coming in, or I know when I'm getting blackberries and that, I already have my regular mead here. It goes back into there for about 4 more days with my fruit, and then it goes back into one of these, and then it sits. And you're not going to see a real heavy, I'll see it bubble and that a little bit, but nothing like when you're doing the first fermentation. I don't add any more yeast because I've never killed my yeast that were in there.
But you never add your fruit to start with?
No, I never do it on a primary. Some people do. You can do that. You can put your fruit in a primary. Get this book right here. It has a lot of that where he talks about doing it either a secondary or primary. Plus, it gives you like the poundage of fruit that you need for a really, some of these for a 5-gallon batch, if you want a really fruitful one, you're adding 10 to 12 pounds of fruit.
That's why having a large initial fermentation vessel is handy to have. You can do small stuff, but having a big fermentation vessel, if you're adding a lot of fruit, and fruit comes along with its own complications. When if you're adding the one that he makes in that, I was going to try, it's like 5 pounds of this berry, 5 pounds of blueberries, and 6 pounds of strawberries. And the next thing you know, you got 20 pounds of fruit to make this. And so you have to have a pretty large vessel in order to make this, if you're going to make his specific recipe. Another thing that we'll mention, that a lot of the recipes will start with you cooking the honey and the water to get some of the foam and some of that. A lot of recipes call for you heating it, and I've never done that. You probably don't.
I do warm my honey to about 100 degrees.